Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, I'm talking about album number 7 from Tangerine Dream, Stratosfear. So, this album is a bit of an end of an era for Tangerine Dream. It's the last studio album to feature Peter Baumann, even though he was also on board for their first soundtrack album in Sorcerer and another live album, Encore, after this. And this is also the last in the trilogy of what is probably still considered to be the band's biggest and most influential studio classics. It does mark a pretty noticeable shift in approach from those previous two albums, though. Phaedra and Rubicon primarily aimed to sound big, open, and spacious, aiming for vast soundscape building for its own sake, and certainly nailing that quite well. Stratosfear doesn't have quite the same sense of open vastness that the previous two albums had, and is a noticeable step back downwards from Rubicon in terms of its production and mastering. If Phaedra evoked exploring some unknown reach of another galaxy, and Rubicon evoked exploring the depths of the ocean, Stratosfear evokes, like, a desert or wasteland of some kind. It feels extremely desolate and empty, the synths feel drier and harsher, and there's not quite the same sense of wonderment. But there's also another big shift in their approach here on top of that, towards much more accessible melodies. It's still an electronic ambient record, first and foremost, very much in the same style as those last two, but the four compositions here feel ever so slightly more like actual songs rather than open-ended improvisations. They have markedly more coherent tunes and structures and feel more carefully planned out. Perhaps if some fans were more into their more uncompromising experimental side, I might be able to see why a few of them might not be as taken by this album as those last two. But for me, as you might be able to surmise from the fact that I own a CD copy, it's pretty handily my favorite project they put out up to this point. Not only do the more coherent tunes go a really long way into furthering my enjoyment of this thing and making it markedly easier to connect with when I was in high school, I'd also argue this is the point at which Tangerine Dream really first nailed down a recognizable signature sound they could truly call their own. That's obviously not to take away from their previous albums, which were really cutting edge and completely unlike anything out there at the time, but albums like those, set down genre formulas that have been copied by all number of artists time and time again over the decades, to the point where, if they were to come out right now, they might not stick out quite as much. If I heard an album that sounded like Phaedra or Rubicon coming out right now, I'd think, oh, you're making a cool progressive ambient synth album. Or if I heard a new album that sounded like Zeit, I'd think, oh, you're making a cool minimal dark ambient album. But if I heard someone come out with an album that sounded like Stratosfear, I'd think, oh, you're making an album that sounds like Tangerine Dream. The particular mix of synth arrangements, the particular way the melodies are constructed, in their, light, not really classical inspiration, which, compared to the more overtly classical-sounding arrangements that came from fellow synth pioneers like Vangelis or Jean-Michel Jarre, have much more of an overtly classic prog rock flavor to them instead, that clearly informs TD's more prog-centric background, combining their previous more improvisational approach, which is still kind of there, with more of a pop sensibility that puts them closer to a band like Kraftwerk, while still obviously distinct from them. The sound and approach of this album feels specifically like their thing. There's a feel to this album that I don't get in quite the same way out of any others, either in or out of the 70s synth pioneer field. It also certainly doesn't hurt that this is the first album in their catalog where I enjoy every track here roughly the same amount, where I feel each one adds something specific to the table and I couldn't even pick one that felt right as least favorite. Well, for what it's worth, I do have a favorite track here, and it's the opener and title track. This is really the kind of opener that pulls you in right away, while there's a fairly dry guitar intro in the beginning to set the mood, which itself returns at the very end of the track to bookend things in a neat way. Things do get kicked up a notch pretty quickly with all these fast-paced synth arpeggios and dismal but oddly addicting minor key melodies that keep building and reaching pretty triumphant heights, adding more simple but exciting melodic developments, and even bringing in some light, drum rolling as well near the end to even further that constant sense of pulse and momentum. It's pretty well remembered as one of their most iconic tracks for good reason, and it's easily the most openly exciting and energetic moment on the album, while the rest of the project tends to strip things back more. But the remaining 3 tracks here are all roughly equal highlights for their own reasons. The Big Sleep in Search of Hades feels like it might be an easy pick for least favorite on paper, with it only being like 4.5 minutes compared to the lengthier 9, 10, 11 minute running times of the other tracks. And probably also the most stripped back and simple cut of the 4 as well. But at the same time, I think this track might have the best lead melody on the album. There's this one moment which acts as the track's chorus with this one synth riff that descends 2 notes and steps right back up to be joined by a foreboding chord played on the mellotron. That lead riff is literally the first thing that pops into my mind whenever I think about this album in passing, or whenever I think of this earlier classic era of Tangerine Dream in general. It's so simple but so striking. Also, the little harpsichord and flute passages added in between as lead up to that riff are a nice distinct flavor as well that the other tracks don't have, bringing back a little bit of that King Crimson-y flavor at that band's most stripped back and medieval inspired. Great stuff. 3 a.m. at the border of the marsh from Okefenokee. That's a track that admittedly takes a while to get going, but does offer some particularly unique textures of its own. At first hitting you with nothing but tiny, minimal synth blips, very slowly, playing single notes, over a backdrop of some, old western-inspired harmonica playing, but then hitting you with a dissonant mellotron choir that sounds pulled out of the Monolith theme from 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then fading into another set of synth arpeggios that form a particularly strong groove in their own right. Maybe it doesn't go as hard as the title track, but it feels like a solid return to that track's sense of urgency and underlying pulse. Also, the bits of flute accompaniment and eventual return to the Old West harmonicas at the end are a nice touch. And finally, there's Invisible Limits, the big 11.5-minute finale. While admittedly that cut doesn't have nearly as much of a coherent tune as the other 3, and feels like the least of a self-contained song, that greater length is certainly well utilized, as the track has a lot more progression and evolution than the other cuts, and feels like it may as well be stitched together out of 4 or 5 different parts. It starts out even more subtle than the previous track with nothing but single bass notes at first, but eventually builds up those mellotron strings again with some more flute, and creates this really nice, tender, and bittersweet emotional moment, especially through the first 3 minutes or so. Though then there's also a darker section with a fuzzy guitar solo, the faster synth arpeggio grooves come back in, and the guitar soloing gets faster as well to match it. There's a different melodic detour introduced, and that's all before the track seems to break apart into more formless experimentalism right around the 7-minute mark, before going back to a lower-key ambient passage, and finally closing in its last 3 minutes with a melancholy solo piano passage with a little bit of flute accompaniment again. It once again all feels very desolate and sad and dry and lonely. I mean, this track may have the least structure to it and is the one I'm least able to recall a melody from, but has some of the album's biggest emotional moments as well. Each of these 4 tracks feels distinct, has its own strengths and weaknesses, but they all feel like they come together really cohesively as part of the same overarching whole and feel like logical continuations and payoffs of one another. There feels like there's some kind of unspoken narrative arc following through the entire thing. All of it comes together really dang well, and every piece of it feels like it has some kind of purpose and greater context with no wasted space. Now, I'm not going to say Stratosfear, changed my life, or I think it's some untouchably perfect masterwork. There are valid reasons not to get into this one at all, or see it as a step down from their last 2. Again, as mentioned earlier, the production is not exactly all that deep or impressive or well layered. It's a very dry, dismal, and empty sounding album. And while that's once again very much by design, it does result in a listen that maybe hits an upper bound to how much I can really get out of it. Especially with the album running on only 35 minutes total, that can feel pretty scant. It's not the kind of thing I listen to all the time, and there are a couple of other albums they came out with later that I feel took the approach they set into motion here and developed it even further with compositions that feel even more exciting and full-sounding and futuristic to me while also getting less attention. But again, Stratosfear is unquestionably one of my favorites in their catalog and one of the albums of theirs that's most frequently brought me back over the years. It's another undisputed classic. I definitely say it's a must-listen for any ambient 70s synth or even 70s prog fans. It's one of their most, if not straight up, their most defining work, I feel like. And I'm overall feeling a strong 8.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.